Edgar Allan Poe was one of the most widely read romantic writers of the 19th century. Credited for writing the first detective story and pioneering both science fiction and modern horror, he could be called the godfather of mystery. The romantic fluidity of his writing style captures every detail of the story, setting an undertone for the reader's imagination. Poe said himself, "For my own part, I have never had a thought which I could not set down in words with even more distinctness than that with which I conceived it." Actors such as the great Vincent Price have dramatized his tales, and more recently, John Cusack played Poe in a 2012 film titled The Raven. Edgar was a middle child born by actors traveling through Boston on January 19, 1809. By age 3, both parents had passed. He and his 3 siblings were separated and raised by different families. A wealthy tobacco salesman and his wife, John and Frances Allen, fostered Edgar and moved him to Richmond. Mr. Allen had hoped to groom Edgar to become a businessman. Friction began between Poe and Allen as Poe showed more interest in becoming a writer. After studying abroad in England, in 1826, Poe attended the University of Virginia. Although he was an exceptional student, Allen gave him little financial assistance. He attempted to pay his way by gambling and acquired a huge debt. Living very poorly, he had to leave school after his first term and return home. Upon his return, he learned of his childhood sweetheart's, Elmira Royster's, engagement. Heartbroken, he set out for Boston to pursue writing. By age 18, Poe published his first book titled Tamerlane, a poem expressing pride and loss in regards to love and death. Besides being a writer, Poe explored his second dream, which was to join the United States Army. In 1827, he enlisted under the name Edgar A. Perry. Within a couple years in his military career, he was promoted to sergeant major. He learned that his foster mother had become ill with consumption or tuberculosis. Although he rushed to be by her side, he didn't get there before she passed. In fact, she had already been buried. Briefly, Allen and Poe came to an understanding. With some help of Mr. Allen, Poe attended West Point Academy. While there, he published another book funded by his fellow cadets. The relationship between Poe and Allen fell apart again when Poe had heard secondhand that Allen had remarried. Soon after, he was thrown out of West Point. Poe set out for Baltimore and reconnected with his Aunt Maria Clem. She became a new mother figure for him. Shortly after, he fell in love with his first cousin, Virginia. He learned at that time that Allen had died, leaving Poe entirely out of his will and giving his estate to an illegitimate child. Poe, still financially devastated, began publishing short stories and entered some of them into the contest. One of his stories, The Manuscript Found in a Bottle, was selected. This led him to the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, where he obtained an editorial position. Poe was instrumental in the financial success of the Messenger. It soon became the Southern's most popular magazine. His gripping stories and harsh book reviews attracted an abundance of readers. He is credited as being a fearless critic, not only criticizing the author's stories, but the authors themselves, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne. Rufus Griswold was a well-known author in which he criticized. A tumultuous relationship between the two began and carried out long after Poe's death. Poe had stated, "In criticism, I will be bold and as sternly, absolutely just with friend and foe. From this purpose, nothing shall turn me." Poe moved Marie and Virginia to Richmond, where he married Virginia. He was 27 and she was 14. He wrote the poem Eulalie as a way of describing his joy in being married and family life. There he lived happily for about 6 years off and on, writing some of his most famous works. Still financially challenged, he traveled often seeking work, and found his way to New York, where he published his only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Within a year, he set out to Philadelphia in 1838. He worked for many different magazine companies such as Burton's and Graham's and Alexander's Weekly Messenger. Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque was his first book of short stories, in which he was paid 25 free copies of his own book. This prompted him to become an advocate for writers. He wanted to seek higher wages and an international copyright law to protect them from plagiarism, but he was limited due to finances. In 1841, he published the first detective story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, 46 years before Sherlock Holmes' introduction in 1887. Although he was gaining fame and notoriety, he was still barely making ends meet. In 1842, his beloved wife became ill with tuberculosis. So many people Poe was close to had passed away from consumption, including his mother, brother, and foster mother. Another devastating blow for Poe. The Raven was published in 1845. This became a pivotal point in his career, and his popularity and notoriety reached an all-time high. He began lecturing and drawing large crowds. He began to demand higher pay for his work. He purchased a failing journal company called the Broadway Journal as his own. After a year, however, his short-lived dream had failed. While dealing with the financial failure of the Broadway Journal, he learned that Virginia's condition was deteriorating, and he returned home. His sweet Virginia passed away in 1847 at the age of 24. Poe's creativity had stopped for several months due to his depression. It is said that he began to binge drink during this time and was even hospitalized for a questionable suicide attempt. People had said he just wasn't the same after the loss of his wife. Over the next couple years, he did a lot of traveling and lecturing and tried to find some business partners to help open his own magazine company that would become the Stylus. He wasn't successful as he continued to drink, although how much is still a topic of debate. He reconnected with Elmira Royster during one of his lectures. She had since become a widow. She was known as his first and last love and inspired the poem Annabel Lee. They soon shared sentiments of engagement. He even joined the Sons of Temperance, which could be compared to a modern-day AA, in an attempt to stop drinking. In 1849, on his way to Philadelphia for a lecture, he stopped in Baltimore. He was found in a bar of a public house that was being used as a polling place for elections. He was described as being incoherent and was sent to Washington College Hospital, where he died a few days later from unknown causes. Many theories surround his death and speculation continues. However, it still remains a mystery. After studying Edgar Allan Poe's character for months to prepare for his role in The Raven, John Cusack offered his opinion during an interview with Peter Travers, a Rolling Stone movie critic, on ABC News.
I do have a theory of what was going on. I mean, some people think he was poisoned. There's some other kind of even more elaborate, wild conspiracy theories, but the one that I read from the biographies that was most plausible was they had these voting scams, and they would get a bunch of people down at the docks and homeless folks and people who were drunks, and they would bring them down to vote, and then they would bring them to a warehouse and they'd put other people's clothes on them, keep them liquored up, and bring them down to vote again. And they would do this for a while to kind of rig the elections. The fact that Poe ended up sort of totally incapacitated and wearing someone else's clothes that were a little small for him, muttering something about Reynolds, you know, find Reynolds. They think that he was a part of one of these voting scams down by the docks on one of his legendary benders.
After learning of his death on October 11, 1849, Elmira wrote a letter to Miss Clem expressing her sorrow. But not everyone shared these feelings. Rufus Griswold wrote a tasteless obituary as a last attempt to dismiss his works, remarking that few will be grieved by his death. This in turn brought everlasting interest in Poe. His works were more sought out than ever before. Poe is among the most widely read and influential of American writers in history. This year marks the second centennial anniversary of his death. May he rest in peace forevermore.